DevilNeverCry.
What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry, and you join me today for my review of Live Alive, a modern remake of a cult classic JRPG from the 90s that never saw a release outside of Japan. A majority of the original game's content stands completely untouched, though it's received a lick of new paint in the form of the 2D HD graphics. Much like the ones you've seen in Octopath Traveler, a fusion of retro pixel art and 3D environments. It's worth mentioning that the remake initially dropped on the Switch last year, but the footage you're seeing here and what my review is based upon is the PS5 version of Live Alive. Square Enix were kind enough to provide a copy ahead of release, allowing me to get this video to you on release day. As mentioned, Live Alive is a classic JRPG that sees you take on the role of 8 different characters set across 8 different time spans. And the eclectic nature of each of these scenarios definitely is a key strength of Live Alive. One scenario plays entirely like a stealth game, where you step into the roles of a ninja tasked with infiltrating a castle in Edo period Japan. Of course, you could treat it like a standard JRPG and fight your way to the objective, or you can get there without taking out anybody. Or another scenario plays much like a horror game set in the distant future aboard a spaceship where you play as a robot fighting for his survival as a tragedy takes place. The game puts you in the shoes of these characters just long enough for things to be enjoyable, but not too long to the point where the veneer fades off and things start to get boring or repetitive. And I think the pacing of this game is also another one of its key strengths. For a JRPG to be completed in just over 20 hours is almost unheard of, especially in this day and age of gaming where JRPGs or just RPGs in standard can go on for 50 hours plus. That being said, you can definitely rack up the playtime if you want to go for 100% completion or view some of the extra different endings you can possibly get. Before I get ahead of myself, of course, Live Alive isn't just exploration and world building, combat plays a large part in it as well. Combat encounters essentially play a part in every single scenario, where at set intervals or running into specific enemies, you're thrown into a grid-based system where you're able to move around the battlefield, attack, dodge, use items, and repeat ad nauseum. In most instances, when combat is described as simple, it can often be seen as a negative, but here in Live Alive, it fits right in. You don't have to worry about managing resources or MP, or min-maxing your equipment. You don't have to worry about leveling up or grinding out levels. Each combat encounter is sequestered away entirely, where you're healed automatically after every single encounter, and anybody who passes out during combat is immediately revived regardless. With such an accessible rule set for combat, it allows you to simply dive in and give it your all before swiftly moving on. That being said though, the combat isn't necessarily a cakewalk. You do have to pay attention to what enemies and bosses in particular are doing, and make sure that your spacing and timing is pretty on point, otherwise you're going to see yourself facing that game over screen quite often. One of the quality of life changes they've implemented in Live Alive is an autosave function, which can definitely save you from replaying large chunks of the game, particularly when you run into tough enemies or bosses that you weren't quite expecting. Though the game does let you save anywhere and everywhere you want at any given point in the game, which I definitely make sure you make use of quite often when playing Live Alive. Of course, we also can't talk about classic JRPGs without briefly mentioning the soundtrack. Yoko Shimomura of Kingdom Hearts fame composed the original soundtrack for Live Alive and actually returned for the remake to help supervise the rearrangement of the soundtrack. And I can safely say, like most great JRPGs out there, the soundtrack for Live Alive is absolutely fantastic. Whether it's getting your blood pumping during an intense combat encounter, or setting a melancholic tone during an emotional turning point, the soundtrack doesn't step out of line throughout the entire experience. All in all, my experience with Live Alive was generally quite positive. If there's anything that I could put as a mark against the game, it's that not all of the story scenarios or the characters are necessarily created equally. There were some scenarios such as the Wild West or the Edo Japan or distant future scenarios that I really enjoyed, whilst there were others like the prehistory that didn't necessarily resonate with me all too much and I didn't enjoy as much as the others. Though that all comes down to a matter of taste. What I can say though is that if you find yourself not necessarily enjoying one scenario all too much, you know that the other scenarios are just around the corner due to how things are paced. Of course, if you want to, you can jump around between each of the different scenarios, though if you want to get to what I guess you could consider the true and final ending, where you're able to basically recruit the entire party and have them coalesce to form a typical JRPG squad, you're definitely going to want to complete each and every single one of these scenarios. So to summarize, if you want a JRPG that isn't going to eat up all of your spare time, or you want to dive into a game that at one point was considered a cult classic, I can definitely recommend Live Alive. Or as some people like to call it, Live Alive. Have I been saying that wrong this entire time? Let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done though, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.